February 3, 1952, 02:17 a.m. Weather station alert, Ellesmere Island, 82 degrees 30 north. The wind does not howl here. It presses. It presses against the aluminum siding of the station, against the antenna mast iced so thick it no longer looks mechanical, against the small building where 4 men are awake while the rest of the world sleeps. The Arctic night is complete, no horizon, no sky, only darkness layered with cold. Inside, the station smells faintly of diesel fuel, damp wool, and metal that has never fully warmed. A single bulb hums overhead. Its light doesn't flicker, it endures. Captain Robert H. Ellsworth, U.S. Air Force Weather Service, sits at the observation desk with his gloves laid out beside him, fingers bare, skin reddened and cracked. He writes slowly, not because the data is complex, but because there is no urgency left in his movements. Outside temperature, -46 degrees F. Barometric pressure, steady. Wind unchanged. He pauses not to think. Just pauses. Across the room, Sergeant Thomas Keene adjusts a radio dial out of habit. The signal from Thule Air Base won't come for another hour. He knows this. He still checks. The static breathes softly like a distant ocean trapped in wires. No one speaks. Not because there is tension. Not because of conflict. But because there is nothing pressing to be said. 6 months ago, silence felt heavier. It landed on them after dinner, after checklists were complete, after the last scheduled transmission of the day. Back then, each quiet moment seemed to ask for filling: conversation, jokes, stories about home, exaggerated memories of warmth and crowds and voices overlapping. But something has shifted. Now the silence no longer waits for them. Ellsworth leans back slightly in his chair. His breath fogs, then clears. He does not think about his wife in Minnesota, not because he misses her less, but because the ache no longer demands attention. This is the first thing no one notices when it happens. Loneliness doesn't disappear dramatically. It doesn't announce its departure. It simply stops reporting for duty. At 02:21, Keene breaks the quiet not with words but by standing and walking to the observation window. The glass is rimmed with ice crystals that catch the dim interior light. Beyond it, the Arctic stretches flat and infinite, a darkness so complete it feels solid. Keene doesn't feel small looking at it. Months ago, this view made his chest tighten. It reminded him how far he was from faces, from voices, from the constant feedback of other minds acknowledging his existence. Now the vastness does something else. It settles him. Ellsworth watches Keene from across the room. He has noticed this change, not consciously, not yet, but it registers somewhere beneath thought. The men still function the same, duties are met, logs are precise, jokes still appear occasionally, dry and understated. But something subtle has withdrawn. The need to check oneself against another person. The reflex to perform even when no one is watching. From a Jungian perspective, this is not detachment. It is redistribution. But no one here has language for that. At 02:34, Ellsworth steps outside for the scheduled instrument check. The moment the door opens, the cold strikes with physical force, an invisible wall that steals breath instantly. He moves with practiced economy, counting steps, avoiding unnecessary exposure. The aurora flickers faintly overhead, green, slow, indifferent. He checks the anemometer, taps ice-free, records numbers by headlamp glow. And then something happens. Nothing external. Nothing dramatic. Standing there alone, wind pressing, darkness endless, Ellsworth realizes he is not narrating the moment to himself. No internal commentary. No imagined listener. Just presence. This is new. Earlier in the winter, his mind filled every solitary task with mental dialogue. Explanations, justifications, silent rehearsals of conversations that might happen later, letters he might write, words he might use to describe this place to someone who wasn't here. Now there is no rehearsal. The moment does not require translation. He feels competent, whole, complete enough to stand unobserved. Inside, Keene logs the time of Ellsworth's exit automatically. He notices, without concern, that he hasn't felt the urge to speak for over an hour. No itch, no pressure, no sense of being cut off. This is not numbness. It is not withdrawal. It is not depression. It is something quieter and far more difficult to name. When Ellsworth returns, he stamps snow from his boots and hangs his parka. The routine unfolds without commentary. They exchange a glance, brief, neutral, uncharged. No reassurance needed. Later, in official reports sent south, psychologists would struggle to categorize what was happening at stations like this. Men who showed no signs of antisocial behavior, no emotional flattening, no hostility toward others, yet also no longing. The word loneliness stopped applying, but so did isolation. From a Jungian perspective, this moment marks a subtle psychological shift. When psychic energy once used to maintain relational mirrors turns inward, consolidating around an internal center of authority. But here, at 82 degrees north, it simply feels like something unnecessary has gone quiet. Ellsworth sits again at the desk. He writes the next line in the logbook. Then he stops. Not because he's distracted. Because, for the first time in months, he is not thinking about how this moment will be remembered. And somewhere in that absence, something else has taken its place. Something steadier. Less reactive. More final. The question, unasked but present, hangs in the room. If you no longer need people to feel whole, what exactly is doing the holding now? Morning does not arrive here the way it does elsewhere. There is no gradual light, no softening edge to the dark. At 0900, the station clock clicks forward and the men rotate shifts as they have for months, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. The bulb overhead hums on, the Arctic remains unchanged. Lieutenant James Caldwell, newly awake, pours coffee from a dented pot that has been reheated too many times to count. He nods once at Ellsworth, not a greeting, an acknowledgement of presence. That used to be enough. Now even that feels optional. Caldwell sits at the narrow mess table and stares into his cup. The coffee tastes burnt, it always does, but he notices something else, something he hasn't admitted even to himself. He is not waiting for anyone to speak. Earlier in the winter, meals felt unfinished until conversation filled the space. Stories were traded like rationed warmth, accounts of cities, women, crowded rooms, remembered laughter. Each sentence acted like a tether, a way of confirming I am still connected. But this morning, the silence around the table doesn't feel like absence. It feels occupied. From a Jungian perspective, this is the beginning of a reallocation, not away from others in rejection, but away from dependency. Psychic energy that once leaned outward for confirmation has started to circulate internally. Yet here no one frames it that way. They only sense the difference. Caldwell takes a sip, sets the cup down. His thoughts do not wander to home, they do not drift toward imagined futures. There is no urge to compose letters in his head, no mental rehearsal of how he might describe this experience to someone who hasn't lived it. Instead, his attention rests inward, but not in a self-absorbed way. More like a gravity shift. At 0942, the radio crackles to life. A scheduled transmission window. Sergeant Keene adjusts the dial with precise movements, fingers already knowing the resistance points. A voice fades in, distant, clipped, formal. Fuel airbase, routine check-in. Keene responds cleanly, weather data, instrument status, no embellishment. The voice on the other end asks a question not on the checklist. How are conditions holding up there? 6 months ago, Keene would have felt a reflexive opening in his chest. A chance to be heard, a chance to transmit more than numbers. Now there's a pause. Not awkward. Just neutral. Stable, Keene says, and means more than the weather. When the transmission ends, the static returns. No one comments on it. No one fills the gap with humor or relief. Ellsworth notices something then, something subtle but undeniable. External contact no longer changes the room. The station does not brighten at the sound of another human voice, nor does it deflate when the signal fades. The internal atmosphere remains steady, self-contained. This is when the replacement becomes undeniable. It is not apathy. It is not superiority. It is not emotional withdrawal. It is an internal ballast, a weight that holds steady without needing counterbalance. That afternoon, Caldwell is assigned to calibrate instruments outside the station perimeter, a solitary task, he layers up, checks his gear, and steps into the cold. The world greets him the same way it always has, with indifference. But his internal response has changed. Earlier in the season, solitude sharpened his self-awareness. Each step across the snow felt observed by an imagined audience. His mind narrated constantly, "You're doing this alone, you're far from everyone, this matters." Now there's no narration. Just action. The wind presses, snow crunches, his breath fogs inside his mask. He works methodically, without hurry and without resistance. And somewhere in the middle of the task, Caldwell realizes something unsettling. He is not thinking about how this solitude defines him. He is simply here. From a Jungian perspective, this is not isolation, it is differentiation. The psyche has stopped outsourcing its sense of reality to reflection. The ego no longer requires constant interpersonal validation to remain coherent. But this realization does not arrive as insight. It arrives as absence. The absence of strain. That evening, back inside, the men eat in near silence. Forks scrape enamel plates, a chair leg shifts, someone clears his throat. No one feels ignored. No one feels unseen. The emotional temperature is oddly even, neither warm nor cold. Ellsworth watches the others with a professional eye honed by years of command. He sees no signs of breakdown, no withdrawal symptoms, no irritability. If anything, the men are calmer than before. More contained. Less reactive. And that is what unsettles him. He realizes quietly, privately, that if a relief crew arrived tomorrow, he would welcome them professionally, but not emotionally. Not because he dislikes people, but because the internal structure that once leaned outward has completed itself. Later that night, Ellsworth lies on his narrow bunk staring at the low ceiling. The station creaks softly as the temperature shifts. Somewhere, metal contracts. His thoughts drift not outward but inward. And for the first time, he wonders, what happens when this ends? What happens when he returns south to rooms full of voices, faces searching for reaction, for affirmation, for response? Will this internal steadiness survive contact? Or will it be mistaken for distance, coldness, loss? The realization settles slowly. This replacement, this inner authority, does not announce itself as a gain. It quietly removes the need for something that once felt essential. And once removed, it cannot simply be put back. Ellsworth closes his eyes. The station hums. Outside, the Arctic remains vast and indifferent. Inside, something has stabilized. And the men do not yet understand that this quiet replacement will follow them home. August 19, 1952, 14:06 hours. Forbes Field Airstrip, Topeka, Kansas. The heat hits first. It rises from the tarmac in visible waves, thick and disorienting after months of cold so absolute it felt abstract. The sky is wide and blue, the kind of blue that suggests abundance, sound, movement, proximity. Captain Robert H. Ellsworth steps down from the transport aircraft and pauses, just long enough for the men behind him to nearly bump into his back. He moves aside, clears the path, regains his composure. Around him, everything is in motion. Engines idle, ground crews shout, paperwork flaps in the wind. Somewhere nearby, laughter breaks out, sharp, quick, uncontained. 6 months ago, this would have felt like relief. Now it feels loud. Ellsworth does not flinch, he does not grimace, he simply registers the contrast. His posture remains upright, controlled, unhurried. Inside, the same internal steadiness that carried him through the Arctic night holds firm. Too firm. As the men collect their gear, families begin to approach from behind the cordon, wives, children, parents. There is motion in their faces before they even reach him. Expectation, anticipation, the silent demand of reunion. Ellsworth spots his wife Margaret standing near the edge of the group. Her hair is pinned neatly, just as it always is. She is smiling, but the smile has a question in it. He walks toward her. They embrace properly, correctly. She smells of soap and summer heat. Her arms are warm, familiar. And yet something does not surge. There is no emotional flood, no internal swell to match the outward gesture. He feels affection, certainly, care, recognition. But not relief. Margaret pulls back slightly and looks at him, searching, not suspicious, just attentive. "You look well," she says. Ellsworth nods. "I am. It is the truth." That night, the house feels crowded despite its familiar layout. The refrigerator hums, a radio plays in the next room, a neighbor's car passes outside, tires hissing against pavement. Margaret talks about letters she wrote about the garden, about small changes in town. Ellsworth listens carefully. He responds when appropriate. He is not distracted. But he notices something quietly alarming. He is not leaning forward internally. He is not reaching. The presence of another person no longer completes a circuit that had once felt unfinished. From a Jungian perspective, this moment reveals the cost of individuation when it arrives without preparation. The psyche has reorganized around an internal axis, and external relationships now orbit rather than anchor. But in the living room of a modest Kansas home, it simply looks like distance. Days pass. Ellsworth returns to routine briefings, paperwork meetings. He performs competently, efficiently. Colleagues describe him as steady, reliable, unchanged. But something has changed. In conversations, he no longer feels the subtle urgency to align emotionally. When others speak, he listens, but without the reflex to mirror. He nods, responds, participates. Yet inside, there is no tension if he is misunderstood. That is new. At a dinner with fellow officers, laughter erupts over a shared story. Ellsworth smiles at the right moment, he even chuckles. But part of him observes the interaction from a slight distance, not detached but independent. He realizes then that the Arctic did not make him antisocial. It made him self-contained. This is the danger no one warned them about. Not isolation but portability. The inner authority developed in silence does not dissolve in company. It remains calm and unmoved, quietly altering the shape of every interaction. Margaret senses it more acutely than anyone else. One evening, as they sit side by side on the porch, she turns to him. "You don't seem unhappy," she says carefully, "but you don't seem like you're waiting for anything either." Ellsworth considers this. She is not accusing, she is observing. "I don't feel unfinished anymore," he says at last. The words surprise them both. From a Jungian perspective, this marks a critical point. When the ego no longer seeks completion through others, relationships must reform on new terms or strain under the old expectations. Margaret nods slowly, though the understanding is incomplete. How could it be? Ellsworth looks out at the street. Children ride bicycles, a dog barks, somewhere a radio plays a love song. He feels no aversion to any of it. But he also feels no pull. The quiet center formed in the Arctic has not receded, it has integrated. And now comes the unspoken question, one that will not be answered quickly. Can intimacy survive when it is no longer needed for psychological balance? Or does this new inner authority demand a different kind of connection altogether? Ellsworth does not yet know. He only knows this. He did not lose interest in people. Something else arrived first. And it does not intend to leave. It begins to show in small ways. Not dramatic. Not confrontational. Just noticeable. At 08:30, Ellsworth sits in a conference room with 6 other officers. The air smells of chalk dust and cigarette smoke. A colonel at the head of the table outlines new procedures, his voice firm, practiced. Ellsworth takes notes, neat, precise. Around him, men shift in their seats. One clears his throat repeatedly. Another leans forward, eager, nodding too often. There is an invisible choreography playing out, the subtle dance of approval, alignment, recognition. Ellsworth does not participate. Not out of defiance. Out of absence. When the colonel finishes, he looks around the table. Any thoughts? A pause follows. It is the kind of pause that usually pulls someone forward, that activates the familiar tension. Say something, be seen, confirm your position. Ellsworth feels nothing. The colonel's eyes land on him. "Captain." Ellsworth meets his gaze calmly. "The procedures are sound," he says. "The timeline may need adjustment based on field variability. It is a clean observation, useful, unadorned." The colonel nods once, moves on. After the meeting, a younger officer falls into step beside Ellsworth in the hallway. "You always stay cool in there," the man says, half admiring, half uncertain. "Nothing seems to get to you." Ellsworth considers correcting him, but the truth would be too complex to offer casually. "It's just experience," he replies. The younger officer nods, unsatisfied but unable to articulate why. This is how the new distance manifests. Ellsworth is no longer reactive to social temperature. Praise does not warm him, criticism does not destabilize him, he does not brace himself in anticipation of either. From a Jungian perspective, this neutrality suggests the ego has decoupled from the need for constant mirroring. The internal authority once built in silence now mediates experience before it reaches emotion. But outwardly, it looks like reserve. At home, Margaret feels it most clearly. She notices that Ellsworth no longer seeks reassurance in small ways. He does not glance at her after speaking, checking her reaction. He does not soften statements in anticipation of emotional response. He is not unkind. He is settled. One evening she asks him directly, "Do you still need me?" The question lands softly, but it carries weight. Ellsworth does not answer immediately. He does not want to misunderstand what she is really asking. "I want you," he says carefully. "I'm just not leaning the way I used to." Margaret looks away, toward the darkened yard. In the Arctic, Ellsworth learned how to stand without external support. What he did not learn was how unsettling that can feel to someone who once provided that support without realizing it. This is the paradox. Inner authority does not announce itself as separation, but it changes relational gravity. Friends begin to describe Ellsworth differently. "He's solid," one says. "Hard to read," says another. "Doesn't get worked up," someone else notes, without deciding whether that's a compliment. Ellsworth overhears these comments occasionally. They register but do not sting. This too is new. There is no impulse to correct the image others have of him, no desire to adjust perception. He no longer experiences misunderstanding as a threat. From a Jungian perspective, this marks a crucial crossing. When identity no longer relies on consensus, the individual becomes opaque, not hidden but self-contained. And opacity makes people uneasy. Margaret feels it when they attend a social gathering, neighbors, old friends, familiar rhythms. Conversation flows around them. Ellsworth participates politely. But he does not perform intimacy. On the drive home, she is quiet. "You're here," she finally says, "but it feels like you're standing on your own island." Ellsworth grips the steering wheel lightly. The road stretches ahead, dark and empty. "I don't know how to bridge it," he admits. That is the truth. The Arctic gave him something invaluable, but it did not teach him how to share it. That night, lying in bed, Ellsworth stares at the ceiling. The house is silent except for the ticking of a clock. He does not feel alone. And that is the problem. Because connection now requires a choice rather than a need. And choices carry weight. The question forms slowly, uncomfortably. If you no longer need people to feel whole, how do you meet them without diminishing yourself or them? The answer does not come. But the distance, subtle, quiet, undeniable, has already settled into place. The reckoning does not arrive as a crisis. It arrives as accumulation. Small moments, minor frictions, silences that stretch just a little longer than expected. By November of 1952, Ellsworth has settled into a rhythm that looks, from the outside, entirely normal. Work, home, occasional social obligations, nothing appears broken. Yet something is unresolved. At the Air Force Base, a psychologist has begun informal interviews with returning personnel from extended isolation postings. Not mandatory, discreet, framed as routine reintegration support. Ellsworth is scheduled for 15:00 hours. The office is warm, almost too warm. Books line the shelves, psychology, physiology, operational manuals. A window lets in late autumn light. Dr. Harold Wexler, civilian consultant, gestures toward a chair. He is in his 40s, careful with his tone, practiced in understatement. "How are you adjusting?" Wexler asks. Ellsworth sits straight-backed, hands relaxed. "Well," he says. Wexler nods, waiting. Silence stretches, not uncomfortable but intentional. Ellsworth does not rush to fill it. That Wexler notices. Any trouble reconnecting? Wexler asks gently. Ellsworth considers the word reconnecting. No, he says, then after a pause adds, but the connections feel optional now. Wexler's pen stills. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment where individuation moves from internal consolidation to ethical challenge. The psyche has found its center, but now must decide how or whether to relate outward from that center. Wexler does not frame it that way. Instead, he asks, does that concern you? Ellsworth thinks of Margaret, of her question on the porch, of the faint disappointment in colleagues who cannot quite read him anymore. I don't feel damaged, he says, but I do feel less available. Wexler leans back slightly. That's not uncommon, he says. Extended isolation can produce a strong internal locus. Some men come back restless, others come back anchored. Anchored. The word lands heavily. Ellsworth leaves the session with no diagnosis, no recommendations, just a confirmation that what he's experiencing is not pathology. That night he walks alone through his neighborhood, leaves crunch underfoot, porch lights glow behind curtains, families gather inside warm rooms, voices overlapping. He feels no resentment, no envy, only a quiet awareness. The inner authority forged in silence has not faded, but it has begun to demand something of him. Not surrender. Integration. Margaret notices the shift before he names it. He begins choosing connection deliberately, not reflexively, not to soothe discomfort. He sits with her in silence, not distant, not distracted, simply present. He listens without scanning for emotional cues. He speaks without hedging. At first this feels strange to her, then steadier. From a Jungian perspective, this is the task few complete, learning to relate from wholeness rather than toward it. One evening, Margaret says something quietly revelatory. You're not pulling away, she says. You're standing still. I just didn't know how to stand with you there. Ellsworth exhales slowly. Neither did he. This is the reckoning. Not the loss of people, but the loss of unconscious dependence. And in its place, a responsibility. To choose presence. To choose engagement. To choose intimacy without needing it to stabilize identity. The Arctic taught him how to be alone without breaking. Now life is teaching him something harder. How to be with others without dissolving. The balance is delicate, unfinished. But for the first time since his return, Ellsworth senses that the quiet replacement was not an ending. It was a beginning, one that demanded intention. The question lingers, gentler now but still unresolved. Can connection survive when it is chosen rather than required? The answer is forming. Slowly. Years later, the Arctic returns to Ellsworth, not as memory but as reference. It is 1959 now, a different posting, a different office. His hair has begun to gray at the temples. The world has grown louder, television sets glowing in living rooms, radios spilling voices into every quiet hour, conversations layered with urgency and opinion. Yet inside him the stillness holds. Not rigid. Not defensive. Integrated. Ellsworth sits alone in his office after hours reviewing reports by the soft light of a desk lamp. Outside, the base has gone quiet, footsteps echo faintly in corridors. Somewhere, a door closes. He sets the papers aside and leans back. There is no sense of waiting. From a Jungian perspective, this is the outcome rarely dramatized, when individuation does not isolate but stabilizes. When the ego no longer seeks reflection to confirm its shape, yet remains capable of relationship. Ellsworth thinks of the men from Ellesmere Island. He has kept in touch with one Sergeant Keane. Their letters are sparse, factual, unemotional, and meaningful. They do not perform friendship. They inhabit it. At home, his marriage has changed, not cooled but clarified. Margaret no longer asks if he needs her. She knows the answer. He chooses her. Every day. This is the difference. The quiet replacement did not remove people from his life, it removed the urgency attached to them. The desperation to be seen. The reflex to explain. The fear of standing unmirrored. What remains is not detachment. It is proportion. Ellsworth remembers standing outside the weather station at 02:17 in the Arctic dark, the aurora barely moving overhead. He remembers the absence of narration, the calm weight of simply being. That moment never left him, and he understands now what it replaced. Not interest in people, but reliance. From a Jungian perspective, this is the psychological shift many mistake for withdrawal or emotional coldness, but it is neither. It is the psyche discovering it can hold itself. That discovery does not make others irrelevant. It makes them real. Ellsworth turns off the lamp and stands. The office fades into shadow. He does not rush, there is no pressure. As he walks down the corridor, he passes framed photographs, teams, ceremonies, groups of men smiling stiffly at the camera. He recognizes the expressions. They are not false. They are incomplete. Outside, the night air is mild, stars are visible. He pauses just once and looks up. The same sky. Different context. The story you've been watching is not about isolation. It is not about losing warmth or connection. It is about what quietly replaces the need to be reflected. And what becomes possible when connection is no longer a requirement, but a choice. If you have felt this shift yourself, it may have unsettled you, others may have misread it, you may have wondered whether something was missing. But perhaps without realizing it, you crossed a threshold. One where solitude did not empty you. It anchored you.